Good morning. Welcome to Trinity Episcopal Parish's discussion of how to read the Bible. This week we are transitioning to historical context. We had literary context for 2 parts, now we'll have historical context for 2 parts. Why is historical context important to understand? Well, historical context for the Bible is very important for a number of reasons. First of all, we have to take seriously a simple fact that God chose to meet us where we were, and where we are, and where we will be. God is a God who is with us, who desires relationship with us, who desires us to be holy as God is holy, and God is a God that chooses to interact with humanity. It's a very simple tenet that we have as Christians. And because of that, we have to recognize the fact that we as humans are tied to a particular historical context. We're not infinite and all immortal beings, such as God. We are finite. We exist at particular points in time, in particular cultural contexts, with a whole bunch of stuff that surrounds the way that we interpret the world. And for the fact that God, through the Holy Spirit, inspired the Holy Scriptures, that does not mean that the writers don't write out of nowhere. They write in particular points in time for particular audiences with particular things that they are historically conditioned by. Recognizing the historical context of the Bible is a key in being able to help us understand some of the points that our authors are getting at. One of the things that we have to at the very outset talk about is, how did we get the Bible that we have in the first place? That's a historical question. And the reason why this is a historical question is because, as we talked about in literary context, the Bible is a bunch of books that have a main narrative thematic arc of God's relationship with mankind. But those books are written over a very long period of time. Perhaps it might surprise you. But these books necessarily have a thematic arc to it because of the common story, the common account of God's interaction with us. But those particular records of God's interaction with us humans and the inspired accounts that we have today, again, they come from particular places at particular points in time because we are finite. And so understanding how we got the Bible that we have today is really important. So we spent some time talking about the arrangement of the Bible, the verses you see, the chapters you see, even the arrangement of the books within them. But how did we get the books we got? It's a great question, right? Well, it's one that has a little bit of research behind it by some very smart scholars who have devoted their lives in order to answer this question, and perhaps can give us a little bit more insight into how we deal with the question of how do we get the Bible. First, like we talked about in literary context, we have to talk about how do we get the Old Testament and New Testament that constitutes our Bible. Well, the Old Testament, or the First Covenant, you might immediately guess, is the one that came first, the one that historically was written first. How did we get the Old Testament? Well, the Old Testament is a fascinating collection of sources. According to F.F. Bruce, in his book over the biblical canon, the Old Testament came into being as a compiled source over a period, get this, of at least 1,000 years. It is a collection of sources that spans at least a millennium in writing. And so there are huge gaps between the writings of these various portions of Scripture. And in fact, there are huge historical things that are covered in a lot longer period of time than is present in the New Testament, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But the Old Testament compilation, at least 1,000 years. Estimates range between 1,000 and about 1,500 years of compilation. And this is for good reason, because we start with the record of Genesis. Now, as it comes to historical record, we don't have the ability to comment on how on exactly when the creation accounts are in fact being codified. As several scholars have pointed out, that's simply not something that we can do with any veracity. What we instead have to do is we have to go from our resources that are surrounding Scripture and within Scripture, and how we trace the lineage of some of the most important people that we know of. And one of those people that we locate within a particular point in time is Abraham. Abraham in the book of Genesis is kind of the keystone in how we are able to date, at least sociologically and according to human history, when exactly the story of the Bible begins to take shape. Because Abraham is the man that God made the first covenant with. Now, of course, the books of the law are codified within the lifetime of Moses, and literarily, going back to literary context, the contents of Genesis is basically the story of Abraham and going all the way to Jacob, the people of Israel in Egypt, and the liberation of the people from Egypt through the prophet Moses by God's good hand. And so you have, within that time period, you have actually multiple hundreds of years that go by while all of this stuff is going on. And so maybe it shouldn't come as any surprise about how early and long ago these records are. But historically, why is that important? The reason why that compilation time is important is because think about how different culture was for us in the US 100 years ago. If we were to go back to the 1920s as opposed to the 2020s, how different, even in 100 years, was the culture in which we lived in, was the time period and historical situatedness that we lived in, and how different it is now. Think about how massively different 1920 was to 2020 as it came to technology, as it came to culture, as it came to the way that we interacted with each other as common humans. The internet didn't exist in 1920. By golly, it was only about 70 years after we were able to have the first inventions that used electricity. And so we have all of these various things that are in the water, so to speak, that affect the way that we interpret things. Like, for example, when we read the Bible, do we read the Bible as something that is in the context of us using our smartphones and stuff like that? So that when certain biblical passages start talking about the way that communication is handled and the way that books are written, do we even have the historical context to tell us that these books are written before the printing press? The printing press was in the 1500s and revolutionized the way that information is shared. We actually, for the past 500 years, are so conditioned by the printing press and by the availability of books such as these. I can go and buy a book from the used bookstore for like $2. Whereas before the printing press, it was so expensive to be able to put down things on a page because you had to pay people labor to write down. That's why scribes all did their work they were writers. They wrote down all of these things by hand. But even before all that, paper technology, recognizing that in the Old Testament and the New Testament, you either had to take an animal skin and stretch it real thin and dry it and make it so that it is pliable and able to be written upon by basically a graphite stone or by painted types of material, ink, and so on and so forth. But of course, where do you get the ink from, and where do you get the painted materials, and where do you get the graphite from? Again, all of these things we have to recognize. These things right here are so different from the way that books were codified. And so when we talk about how the Old Testament came into being, we're actually talking about a completely different way that books came to be written. In fact, books such as this are not what the Old Testament is written in. The Old Testament originally is written in scroll form. Scrolls, the things that you unroll and roll out, and the records that we use for these things are either scrolls or codices, which are like books except a little bit different. But historically, we have to recognize the technology for writing the books down was so vastly different than the way that we do it today that we really have to get that into our heads when we think about the compilation of the Old Testament, because it gives us a good insight into how the New Testament was written as well. Only the rich and powerful, those who had access to scribes, those who had access to paying people to be able to do these things, were able to do these things effectively. And so when we think about the compilation of the Old Testament, remember, it was a long period of time, 1,000 years, 1,500 years maybe. And it was not like this. It was the writing and codification of story and of ways that we tell things to each other that are just not the way that we operate here in the US. One key way that this is different is that the way that books are written and the way that we pass on story is fundamentally different than the way that cultures prior to the printing press used to operate. And this is where we have to get the concept of oral tradition into our heads. What I mean by oral tradition is the passing on of historical record and knowledge by word only, not by written record. The oral tradition in many cultures, and in fact in many cultures currently today that are outside of the US that don't use historical record keeping such as this, there are incredible traditions of oral storytelling, of being able to tell the history and tell the stories of your people, of your tribe, so to speak, without having a book to accompany you. The art of storytelling is very interesting as it comes to the Old Testament, because guess what? The Old Testament, if you read the Old Testament and if you read the way that some of the books are read, the books of the Old Testament are written in story form. Think about the way that even the books of Genesis begin. In more recent translations, the people who have looked at this, and especially in Hebrew commentaries, have really noted the poetic forms that Genesis 1 and 2 are written in. The order of the creation of the world is written in a poetic form. And the reason why it's written in a poetic form is because it's easy to remember. It's easy to remember the order that things come in. It's kind of like how in modern day we use rhyme and meter to make poetry, so that whenever we speak a poem or whenever we speak a song lyric, we expect our song lyrics and our poetry to rhyme. We expect the things to have a certain flow to them. We don't expect them to be. We don't expect them necessarily to be random. We expect a certain order and form to them, and we expect them to be given in certain ways, certain packages. The trope about country music. Think about that. About country music. What does country music sing about? Well, popular country music. If you track the way that we talk about things or sing about certain things, country music is about romance. It is about a romantic relationship in a lot of ways. It's sometimes in a broken romantic relationship, and we sing about that a whole lot. It's sometimes about things as funny as singing about tractors, singing about things that are in the countryside, so on and so forth. But within that, the context of country music is set within a certain context, right? It's set within a certain situatedness in history. We tell stories in country music in a certain way. So also, in the Old Testament, we tell stories in a certain way. And so when we talk about historical context, we have to think about the way that it was compiled. It was compiled not by writing it down first. It was compiled by the passing on of this to your children and grandchildren. Think about the lines in the Psalms where it says, I will tell out your law to a generation yet to come. He's not just talking about extolling the law or saying how great the law is. He's actually talking about speaking and passing on the actual corpus of the law in the oral tradition format, not in a written record. Now, of course, the books of the law and the scrolls of the law are, of course, a written document, but how do you teach it to someone when you don't have a book in front of you? You memorize it, right? You memorize how the things go on. That was how transmission of these things happened historically in cultures that do not have textual transmission. And let me tell you what, textual transmission was not the way that story was passed on unless you were rich and were able to codify it, or unless you get to the 1500s where printing stuff is cheap and anybody can do it. So we have to remember the way that things came together. But the Bible itself, as a compilation, especially in the Old Testament, recognizing how the books of the Old Testament were then compiled, is another element in this. So we have the transmission of the ideas of the Old Testament. Now we have to think about the compilation of how we got all these books together in the first place. Well, in most Bibles, there are 66 books of the entire Bible. And the Old Testament is a large chunk of that. But the Old Testament is not necessarily, as we talked about in literary context, is not necessarily arranged chronologically. And so when we think about our historical context, we have to think about where they are particularly in certain places. And so as we get into historical context, let's think about compilation. How did we get the books we got? Well, as it comes to historical context, the people of Israel are located in a specific portion of history. And the people of Israel as a people, you really can't start talking about the people of Israel until you start talking about the liberation of the people from Egypt. The people of Israel, the Israelites, the sons and daughters of Jacob, can't really be talked about as a people group until we get to the liberation in Exodus. And the liberation in Exodus is confined within a certain time period, right? It's confined within a certain time period, specifically in the pharaohship of Ramses II. When you get to Ramses II, this is where we are locating historically where the people are liberated from Egypt. But again, after the liberation from Egypt, and after the books of the law that were given to the people in wandering in the wilderness, then you have the historical record of the people of Israel beginning. Joshua, Judges, and Ruth are the lead up and the settling in the land of Canaan, the promised land, as is referred to, which contains a certain socio-political situation, which is that the people are moving into a territory that is not theirs. And the people of the land in which they are going to inhabit are being driven out by God's hand. And so when the kingship is established with Saul being the first king after the judges, the monarchy of Israel operates in a certain way. Again, the chosen kings of Israel, this is where the monarchy period begins with 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, where these are actual histories being written. Very, very likely by some of the court historiographers, but not necessarily. Because 1 Kings and 2 Kings and 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles tell relatively the same story, but in very, very, very different ways. Go back to your literary context and read the contents to see how these are different. But the codification of these things comes to be compiled into the Old Testament by the time that we get to the time of Jesus. So now we're in the time of Jesus, and historically, how does the Old Testament get used by by the followers of Jesus? Well, guess what? The prophets of the Old Testament are seen as being a foretelling of the coming of Christ at a specific time in history. The incarnation of Christ and the infancy narratives, as we call them, of St. Matthew and St. Luke, locate Jesus in a specific historical context. In St. Luke, this is the most explicit that we get. We can almost think about this in the ways that we tell it every Christmas. In the time of Caesar Augustus, there came a decree that the world should have a census, and therefore, so on and so forth. So you see how the decree from Caesar Augustus, during the time of this person and of this person, and then in this particular time, Joseph and Mary went to Bethlehem. And Joseph was in the line of King David. So you see how these historical markers are being brought out in the literary context. But how did we get the Bible that we got? Again, we have to remember our oral culture. You've heard me talk about the dating of some of the books. When were they written? And perhaps some of you who are astute listeners to the literary context were wondering to yourself, well, if Jesus lived between 0 and 33 AD, how do the Gospels, how does the earliest Gospel that we have get dated to like the 54 to 70 time period, and the latest Gospel, St. John's Gospel, get dated to as late as 90 or even the 2nd century? How does that even work? Why does a book that contains the history of Jesus get written so far after Jesus' earthly ministry? Well, guess what, friends? We already have the answer. Oral tradition. The oral tradition within the context of the 1st century is the compilation of the records of Jesus being told orally in the contexts in which it happened. Now, something historically that we have to think about, especially as it comes to this, is historical accuracy. Well, how can we say that what we are reading is accurate? How can we say that the oral culture that we are reading can be as accurate as we say a historical record being written right now? How can we say that something being told by word of mouth and then being codified at a later point in time, how can that be accurate? Well, again, this is where we have to really understand how unique of a context we are in the U.S., and specifically in the 21st century U.S. Sometimes people quip about like, well, I can't even remember what I had for breakfast last week. How are we supposed to, how on the earth are we supposed to think about the accuracy of the Bible? Well, the easy answer is, friends, is that just because you don't use the faculty of memorization and memory does not mean that humans are not capable of this. In fact, in one of the great courses off of audible.com, there is a professor that has studied particularly sub-Saharan African mythologies. And this particular professor actually says that we don't need to have such a, for lack of a better term, we don't need to have such a privileged Western idea of what oral culture is and the accuracy that it is. Because in his research anthropologically, there are generations of storytelling that are almost mirror accurate to the way that generations before, at least as far as 7 generations prior, told the story. The way that they do this compilation can be, he talks about this a little bit in his great courses over African mythologies, but nonetheless, the professor wants to basically say, humans are able to do this, and they're able to do this extremely effectively, but you have to understand the way that they tell the story is in a specific fashion. And this is why, when we talk about historical context, this is how it influences literary context. The stories that are told in a specific fashion. we didn't get in this in literary context, but there's something called, in the way that storytelling sometimes happens in the Old Testament, something called a chiasm, or a chiasmus. This is a particularly important storytelling aspect because it is a mnemonic device, and a mnemonic device is a way that we are able to remember something. A mnemonic device in how a story goes. A really good example of this is Psalm number 1. Psalm number 1 is 6 verses long, but it follows something called a chiasm. It begins with a point, and then there's a second point and a third point in the first three verses. The climax of the story is in the middle of verses 3 and 4, but then verses 4, 5, and 6 mirror from the inside out, like this. Verse 1 mirrors verse 6. Verse 2 mirrors verse 4. Verse 3 mirrors verse 4. Verse 2 mirrors verse 5. Verse 3 mirrors verse 4. And so, when we have our storytellers, they tell it in such a way that they build into the story ways that they can remember things. This also is very important in the style in which they tell it. For example, when we do the comparisons between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are commonly called the Synoptic Gospels, they're written for different reasons, for different historical contexts, to different audiences. But the way that they codify the material is in a similar fashion. This is why when the stories of Matthew, Mark, and Luke match so closely, and yet the verbiage is not exactly the same, this is why oral culture is so important, because it shows that the transference between one city to the next city to the next city to the next region actually remains relatively stable. In fact, it remains remarkably stable. And that's why whenever we get to the codification of these things as books or scrolls, when we get to the time where we are sitting down in the 55 to 90 time period and we have scribes that have begun to codify these things, we can think historically these are going to be relatively reliable. Are they going to contain things within it that are additions and particular uses of the material that are supposed to portray certain things? Of course they are. The Gospels make it real clear the way that the Gospels are written is so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. The Gospels are not written to be biographies of Jesus. They're not written to be historical step-throughs of these things. They're written so that you may believe in Jesus as the Son of God. And so they're not really going to fit neatly into a historical record or a biographical record. Rather, that's why we call them Gospels, because they're a unique kind of writing. But all that to say, friends, when we get into historical context, we actually have to ask very fundamental questions. We have to ask, how do we get the books that we got? And then we even have to ask a further question about how do we recognize our historical particularities as Americans in the 21st century? And how is that so important that it is different than the way that they used to write these things? That's the first little tidbit into how we do historical context. We are going to spend several weeks on this, because historical context is one that requires a lot of background in order to understand. But we will get there together, and I will look forward to walking through with you historically how we get to where we are today and why that's important for how we read the Bible. Thank you so much for joining us, friends, for this edition of How to Read the Bible. As always, friends, stay safe, and may God bless you.